The night it all began. Welcome to Saints for Sleep, a peaceful refuge for your night. If tonight the weight of the world is too much, if you've come here because the hours stretch long and sleep will not come, if there is something in your chest that will not let you rest, I want you to know that you are exactly where you need to be. You did not arrive at this story by accident. Something brought you here, something greater than the algorithm of a screen, something deeper than habit or sleeplessness. Perhaps it was a prayer you did not even know you were praying, a sigh that rose from the deepest place in your heart and drifted upward like a thread of smoke, like the silent cry of someone who needs to feel protected. Because tonight, we are going to speak of protection, not the kind that walls offer or the turning of a lock, but a different kind entirely, one that is invisible and yet more real than any fortress, more solid than any stronghold, more ancient than any castle built by human hands. We are going to speak of a prayer that is over 1,500 years old, a prayer born in darkness, forged in fear, shaped by the faith of a man who knew the most absolute solitude and who discovered in that solitude that God can surround a person from every side, like armor made not of metal, but of the very presence of Christ. That prayer is called St. Patrick's Breastplate, and that breastplate tonight is for you. Perhaps you have heard the name of St. Patrick spoken in the context of celebration, of green shamrocks, of parades in distant cities. But behind all of that is a story that is rarely told in a soft voice, with the reverence it deserves, with the slowness necessary for each word to enter your heart like a balm. It is the story of a boy who was torn from his home at 16 years old, sold into slavery in a strange land, set to tend sheep on mountains swept by wind and rain, completely alone, completely forgotten by the world. And it is in that solitude that everything begins. It is in that darkness that Patrick finds God. And it is from that faith, from that desperate encounter with the divine, that a prayer is born which has shielded millions of souls across the centuries. A prayer that says, with the most powerful simplicity that exists, Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me. Tonight those words will be your shield. If this voice brings you comfort tonight, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to Saints for Sleep, so that every evening a new story of faith and hope will be waiting for you. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let us begin. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you can. Settle your body. Release the tension from your shoulders, and allow your breathing to grow slow and deep. Let the words you're about to hear carry you far from here, to a green and ancient land, to a time when faith was measured in prayers offered in the rain, to the story of a saint who learned that the finest armor in the world is not forged in any furnace, but woven from the name of Christ, repeated in every direction of the soul. We are going to begin. The boy from Britannia. To understand St. Patrick's breastplate, we must first know the man who prayed it. And to know the man, we must travel far back in time, to an age that now seems almost mythological, a world where the Roman Empire still stretched its weary arms across the islands of Britannia, where stone-paved roads linked military forts to villages of rock and clay, where the northern frontier of the known world was traced by a long wall that wound between hills covered in heather and mist. We are somewhere near the year 385 of the Common Era, or perhaps a little later, the exact date having dissolved into the haze of centuries, like so much of that age. Somewhere close to the Great Wall of Hadrian, that barrier the Romans built to separate civilization from chaos, to hold back the peoples of the north, there is a small villa, a rural estate belonging to a family of some standing. They are neither imperial courtiers nor celebrated generals, but neither are they common farmers. They are a Romano-British family rooted in that frontier land, with their own fields, their own servants working the soil, and a Christian tradition reaching back at least 2 generations. The father's name is Calpurnius, He is a deacon of the local church and also a decurion, a civic post that carries administrative responsibilities and a certain measure of respect within the community. His own grandfather, Potitus, was a presbyter, which tells us that Christian faith is no new thing in this household, but an inheritance, a legacy passed from parent to child, the way eye color is passed, or the particular way one holds one's hands. The mother, according to later tradition, is called Contessa, and though the historical record speaks little of her, we can imagine her as so many mothers of that era, holding the household together with steady hands, while the world beyond the walls grew more uncertain with each passing year. Because the world in those years was crumbling. The Roman Empire, which for centuries had meant order, safe roads, law, commerce, stability, was beginning to crack. The legions withdrew slowly from the most distant frontiers. Raiders and invaders grew bolder. Incursions from barbaric peoples across the northern seas came with increasing frequency. There was something in the air of those days that smelled of ending, of farewell, of an old order fading like the last light of evening over the hills of Britannia. And into that dimming world, a child is born. His birth name, according to the oldest sources, is Maywin, a name of Brythonic root that sounds strange to modern ears, a name the world would soon forget, because history would come to know him by another name, the one the church would later give him, Patricius. Patrick, a name that means noble in Latin, though the nobility of this man would come not from his bloodline or his land, but from something far deeper, far more costly, far more beautiful. But that comes later. For now, Maywin is only a boy, an adolescent like any other, growing up in his father's villa, playing near the Roman walls, watching soldiers pass along the paved roads, listening to the reading of the scriptures in the small church of his community without paying them much attention. Patrick himself, many years later, would write in his Confessio, his spiritual autobiography, that in those years of youth he did not truly know God, that his faith was shallow, inherited more by custom than by conviction, worn like a garment one puts on without thinking, like a roof one lives beneath without ever giving thanks that it is there. Let us picture that villa. Let us picture the fields surrounding it, green and damp beneath the grey sky of Britannia. Let us picture the smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, the sound of animals in the stables, the distant bark of a dog, the voices of servants at work in the earth. Let us picture young Maywin walking those fields without knowing that each step brings him closer to a destiny that will change not only his own life, but the history of an entire island, the history of a faith that will spread across the whole of the Western world, the history of a prayer that will one day reach you. Tonight, in this moment, as you listen to these words in the darkness of your room. Because this is how the providence of God works. It moves in silence, in the ordinary, in the apparently insignificant. It prepares the ground for years, for decades, for entire generations, so that one day, at the exact right moment, a seed planted in secret will germinate and bear a fruit no one expected. Calpurnius was a deacon. Potitus was a presbyter. Faith was in the blood of that family, in the air of that house, in the prayers offered each night before sleep. And though young Maywin did not know it, though his adolescent heart was distracted by the things of the world, those prayers were doing their invisible work, weaving a net of grace that would hold him when everything else fell away. The Villa of the Succots was a place of peace, a refuge, a home where life moved with the predictable calm of the seasons. Spring brought wildflowers to the fields. Summer filled the days with light until very late in the evening. Autumn painted the forests in copper and gold. Winter covered the hills in a white frost that shone under the pale morning sun. And in every season, the family prayed. The family ate together. The family lived with the quiet confidence of those who believe that tomorrow will be like today, that the world will keep turning in the same way, that the walls of their home will always protect them. But there are nights when walls are not enough. There are nights when the sea brings something other than salt and wind. There are nights when everything you believed was safe crumbles in an instant, and you discover that the only true protection is not made of stone or timber, but of something you cannot see with your eyes, something that can only be felt with the soul. One of those nights was coming to the villa of Calpurnius, and nothing would ever be the same. Torn from the sea. There are moments in a life that divide existence into a before and an after. Instants that fall like lightning on dry ground and set everything ablaze, that separate forever who you were from who you will become. For young Maywin Succat, that moment arrived when he was approximately 16 years old, on a day whose exact date history did not record, but whose pain was carved forever into his memory. As deep as a scar in the skin, as indelible as the words he himself would write decades later in his Confessio, when he was already an old man and the world knew him as Patrick. The pirates came from the sea. They were Scotty, Irish warriors who crossed the Irish Sea in their boats of hide and timber to raid the coasts of Britannia, taking advantage of the growing weakness of an empire that could no longer protect its most distant shores. They arrived like storms, without warning, without mercy, falling upon coastal settlements and rural estates with the ferocity of those who know no law but iron and violence. They stole cattle, plundered provisions, set buildings alight. And they took people, young people especially, strong adolescents who could be sold as slaves in the markets of Ireland. Maywin was one of those young people. We can imagine the scene, though the precise details are lost to time. We can imagine the cry of alarm that broke the calm of a morning, or the stillness of a night, the sound of hooves on the earth, the foreign voices speaking in an incomprehensible tongue, the smoke beginning to rise from somewhere in the villa. We can imagine the boy seized by rough hands, dragged away from his home, watching the house of his father, the only life he had ever known, grow smaller in the distance as they carried him toward the coast, toward a boat that smelled of salt and fear, toward an unknown horizon that opened before him like the mouth of an abyss. Patrick himself would write that during that raid, his family's home was destroyed. We do not know what became of his parents, whether they were injured, whether they escaped, whether they survived at all. We know only that the boy was separated from everything he loved, everything he knew, everything that gave him the feeling of being safe. In an instant, he passed from being the son of a respected decurion to being a commodity, a nameless body destined for slavery in a wild land across the sea. The crossing must have taken a day or two. The Irish Sea, that narrow stretch of grey and turbulent water separating the two islands, is a treacherous sea of strong currents and unpredictable winds. We can imagine young Maywin in the bottom of the boat, bound perhaps, surrounded by other captives, feeling the rise and fall of the waves, the cold spray breaking over the hull, the nausea of fear mingled with the nausea of the sea. We can imagine his thoughts, the terror of not knowing what awaited him, the despair of one who understands that his life has just shattered and that there is no way to put the pieces back together. And perhaps you too have known that feeling. Perhaps it was not pirates who tore you from your peace, but something came, a diagnosis, a betrayal, a loss, a phone call in the middle of the night, a moment when everything you believed was solid collapsed like a sandcastle before a wave too large to withstand. Perhaps tonight, as you listen to these words, you still carry the echo of that moment, that fracture that divided your life in two, that before and after that changed forever the way you look at the world. If so, I want you to know that Patrick understands. Patrick knows what it feels like. Patrick walked into that darkness before you, and from that darkness he found a light that no one could extinguish. When the boat reached the shores of Ireland, Maywin was sold as a slave. His buyer, according to tradition, was a pagan chieftain, a local lord whose name some identify as Milchu, a powerful man in the northwest of the island. The boy's fate was decided. He would be a shepherd. He would tend sheep in the mountains, far from any human settlement, far from any company, far from any comfort. It was the lowest work, the most solitary, the most despised. Work for those who had no name and no worth in the eyes of the world. Ireland, in those years of the 5th century, was a land entirely unlike the Roman Britannia Maywin had known. There were no paved roads, no aqueducts, no walled cities. The island was divided into dozens of small kingdoms and clans governed by warrior chiefs under the ancient laws of the Druids, pagan priests who kept alive a religious tradition older than Christianity, a tradition of sacred forests and ritual stones, of sacrifices and enchantments, of dark forces the people of the island venerated with a mixture of devotion and terror. For a Romano-British boy, raised in a Christian household, that land must have seemed like the edge of the world, a place where the gods had other names, where the nights were darker and longer, where the wind howled through the mountains like the voice of something ancient and nameless, a place where no one spoke his language, no one knew his story, no one remembered his true name. And yet it was precisely there, in the most improbable place, under the most devastating circumstances, that God began his most beautiful work. For God has that unsettling habit of working best in darkness, of planting his deepest seeds in the hardest ground, of kindling his brightest lights in the most closed-off nights. And the night of Maywin Succat, the night of the boy torn from his home, had only just begun. But in that night, without his knowing it yet, the first star was already shining. The shepherd on the mountain. Imagine a mountain. Do not picture it the way mountains appear in paintings or photographs, clean and majestic beneath a blue sky. Picture a real mountain, an Irish mountain of the 5th century, covered in rough grass and dark heather, wrapped almost perpetually in a low mist that softens everything, that erases the edges of the landscape and turns the world into a place without borders, without limits, without reference. Picture the wind, that Atlantic wind that comes from the west, laden with moisture and salt, that cuts through clothing and settles into bone, that whistles between the rocks with a sound that at times seems like a lament and at times like a warning. Picture the rain, not the heavy, brief rain of summer storms, but Irish rain, that fine and constant drizzle that falls for hours, for entire days at a time, that soaks the earth until it becomes mud and soaks the body until it becomes cold. Now picture a boy of 16, 17 years old, alone on that mountain. No company but a flock of sheep that do not belong to him, and perhaps a sheepdog that obeys instinct more than affection. No shelter beyond some rudimentary structure of stone and thatch that barely keeps out the wind. No food beyond what his master allows, likely some hard bread and milk, the bare minimum to keep him alive and functional. No one to speak with, no one to ask how he is, no one to call him by his name. That boy is Maywin Succat, the future St. Patrick. And that mountain, probably somewhere in County Mayo, near the northwest coast of Ireland, beside a forest the ancient sources call the Wood of Foclert, will be his home for the next 6 years. 6 years. Rest with that number for a moment. 6 years is a long time for anyone, but 6 years of slavery, of absolute solitude, of forced labor on a cold and rain-soaked mountain, with no visible hope of freedom, no contact with family, not even knowing whether his parents are still alive. 6 years like that is an eternity. It is enough to destroy a person, enough to empty a soul of all hope, all faith, all reason to continue. And yet exactly the opposite occurred, because it was on that mountain, in that solitude, in that absolute emptiness of human company, that Maywin found the companionship that would never leave him. It was there that he found God, or perhaps we should say that it was there that God found him. Patrick himself recounts it in his Confessio with words that, after more than 15 centuries, still pulse with the force of lived experience. He writes that in his captivity, the Lord opened the awareness of his unbelief in his heart, so that, though late, he might recall his failings and turn with his whole heart to the Lord his God. He writes that God had mercy on his youth and ignorance, that he cared for him before he knew who God was, before he could distinguish good from evil. He writes that God strengthened him and consoled him as a father consoles a son. And so he began to pray, not as he had prayed before, not with the mechanical routine of one who recites memorized formulas without feeling them, but with the desperate urgency of someone who has nothing left, who has lost everything except the possibility of speaking with God. He prayed 100 times a day and nearly as many times through the night. He rose before dawn to pray, regardless of snow or rain or frost. The cold did not stop him. The darkness did not stop him. The exhaustion did not stop him. Something had awakened inside him. Something stronger than the cold and brighter than the darkness. Something that turned every prayer into a thread of gold connecting him to heaven, that held him above the abyss of despair, that reminded him he was not alone, even as everything around him cried out solitude. Perhaps you too have felt that silence of God in your life. Perhaps you have passed through seasons where you prayed and felt your words bouncing off the ceiling, where you asked for help and the help did not come, where the night stretched and stretched with no sign of any dawn. If so, I want you to listen carefully to what Patrick discovered on that mountain, because it is a truth that can change the way you see your own darkness. What Patrick discovered is that the silence of God is not the absence of God, that sometimes God is nearest precisely when he seems most distant, that solitude, when it is filled with prayer, becomes a sanctuary, that the coldest mountain in the world can become the warmest cathedral in the universe if the presence of God inhabits it. For 6 years, the young slave prayed on that mountain. For 6 years, he learned to speak with God the way one speaks with a friend, with the intimacy of one who shares every hour of the day with someone, every meal, every dawn, every starlit night, every storm. For 6 years, his faith ceased to be a family inheritance and became something entirely his own, something personal, something as intimate and as real as the beating of his own heart. And during those 6 years, without knowing it, he was being prepared. Every prayer was a brick in an invisible construction. Every night of vigil was a training for something that would come later. Every moment of solitude was a lesson he would need to remember when, many years ahead, he stood before the Druids, before the pagan kings, before the dangers of an impossible mission. And it was also on that mountain that he learned something else, something that would become the very heart of his most famous prayer. That the protection of God has no single direction, that God does not protect only from the front or only from behind, but from every side at once. That his presence is like the air we breathe, enveloping us completely, above and below, to the right and to the left, within and without, in every possible direction. The boy who tended sheep on that mountain learned that he himself was the sheep, and that the true shepherd had never taken his eyes from him, not when the pirates tore him from his home, not when the boat crossed the sea, not when the chain of slavery closed around his life. Christ was with him on the mountain. Christ was before him on the path between the sheep. Christ was behind him when the frozen wind pressed against his back. Christ was within him when he prayed his 100 nightly prayers. Christ was above him when he looked up at the Irish sky heavy with cloud. Christ was beneath him when his bare feet pressed into the wet earth. Patrick did not know it yet, but he was already living the breastplate before he ever prayed it. The voice in the dream. 6 years passed. 6 years of mountain and rain, of solitude and ceaseless prayer. 6 years in which the boy became a man, not only by the passage of time, but by the depth of his suffering and the intensity of his faith. Maywin was no longer the distracted adolescent who had been taken by the raiders. He was someone different now, someone forged in the slow fire of adversity, someone whose heart had expanded in prayer until it became a vessel capable of holding the voice of God. And one night, that voice spoke. Patrick recounts in his Confessio that one night, while he slept, he heard a voice that said to him with unmistakable clarity, "You have fasted well. Soon you will return to your native land." And shortly after, the voice spoke again. "Look, your ship is ready." The ship was not nearby. It was not anchored at the coast beside the mountain where he kept watch. It was some 200 miles away, likely at some harbour on the south coast of Ireland, an enormous distance for a fugitive slave who did not know the roads, had no map, no provisions, and risked death if captured during his escape. But Patrick obeyed. That is the word that defines this moment of his life. Obedience. Not blind obedience, not passive obedience, but the brave obedience of one who has learned to trust a voice he cannot see, a promise he cannot verify, a God who over 6 years has proven faithful on the mountain, and who now asks for an act of faith as vast as the sea that must be crossed. Let us imagine that escape. Let us imagine young Patrick leaving his flock in the darkness of the night, walking south through an unknown island, a landscape of dense forests, rivers to ford, treacherous marshes, territories governed by clans who could seize him at any moment. 200 Roman miles, the equivalent of nearly 300 kilometers. A journey that must have taken many days, walking likely at night to avoid being seen, sleeping by day hidden in the undergrowth, feeding himself on whatever he found along the way. Wild berries, roots, perhaps something gleaned from the edge of a field. Every step was an act of faith. Every kilometer walked was a prayer in motion. Every night without being discovered was a confirmation that the voice in the dream was true, that God was guiding his steps, that the promised ship was waiting at the end of the road. And the ship was there. When Patrick reached the coast, he found a vessel about to sail. The accounts suggest it was a merchant ship, probably carrying trade goods, perhaps Irish hunting dogs, which were greatly prized on the continent. At first, the captain refused to take him aboard. Patrick turned away, disheartened, and began to pray. But before his prayer was finished, one of the crew called out to him across the water, "Come quickly, we'll take you on in good faith." And so, after 6 years of captivity, Maywin left Ireland. The ship sailed for 3 days, which suggests the destination was not Britannia directly, but likely the northwest coast of Gaul, present-day France. And what followed was another journey, this time overland. 28 days walking through a devastated, largely uninhabited territory, possibly laid waste by the barbarian invasions that were sweeping the continent in those years. Patrick and the sailors who accompanied him went hungry, grew exhausted, came close to perishing. But the faith of the young freed slave sustained the group. At one desperate moment, when they had no food left, the captain said to him with bitter sarcasm, "You, Christian, you say your God is great and all-powerful, then pray for us, because we are dying of hunger." And Patrick prayed, and soon after he recounts, a herd of pigs appeared in their path, providing them with food enough to continue. At last, Patrick arrived home. He came to his family's villa, or what remained of it, and was reunited with those he loved. His parents received him with tears, pleaded with him never to leave again, begged him to remain with them always. And Patrick, for a time, did. He rested. He healed. He began slowly to rebuild the life the raiders had taken from him. But God had other plans, and those plans would ask of Patrick something far more difficult than escaping from slavery, something far more courageous than walking 300 kilometers through an unknown land, something that would test his faith in a way that not even the mountains of Ireland had managed. God would ask him to go back. The impossible calling. Back in Britannia, Patrick set himself to rebuilding his life. He devoted himself to the study of the Christian faith, traveled to Gaul, and became a disciple of Saint Germanus of Auxerre, one of the most respected bishops of the age, a man of profound learning and theological steadiness who had been sent by the Pope to combat the Pelagian heresy spreading through the British Isles. Under Germanus's guidance, Patrick deepened his knowledge of the scriptures, studied theology, and was ordained first as a deacon and then as a priest. Some accounts suggest he also spent time at the monastery of Lérins, on a small island off the southern coast of Gaul, a centre of monastic life famous throughout the Western Church for its discipline and spiritual fervour. The years passed. Patrick was becoming a churchman, a formed cleric, someone who had left his slavery behind and was now building a respectable life within the Christian community of Britannia and Gaul. His past as a slave in Ireland must have seemed like a distant memory by then, a nightmare overcome, a chapter firmly closed. And then the dreams came. Patrick recounts in his confessio that one night he had a vision. He saw a man coming from Ireland, a man named Victoricus, who carried with him countless letters. He handed one to Patrick, and as Patrick began to read it, he heard the voice of the Irish people, the inhabitants of the region near the wood of Fochlett, beside the Western Sea, exactly the place where he had been enslaved. And those voices cried out together with an urgency that broke his heart. "We beg you, holy youth, come and walk among us once more." Patrick wrote that he was moved to the very depths of his soul, that his heart broke at the sound of those voices, that he could not read any further. He woke, and the decision was made, even though it was the most difficult decision he had ever faced in his life. Consider what that meant. The Irish were the people who had enslaved him. Ireland was the land of his captivity, the place where he had suffered 6 years of solitude, cold, and servitude. Every human logic, every instinct of self-preservation, every sensible counsel would have told him to stay as far as possible from that island, to build his life in the safety of Britannia or Gaul, to let others go and evangelize the Irish pagans. His parents, who had already lost him once, pleaded with him not to go. The comfort of a quiet ecclesiastical life offered him everything a man of his era could desire: respect, stability, community, purpose. But the voice of the Irish kept resonating in his heart. And behind that voice, Patrick recognized another voice, one he had heard before on the mountain during those nights of ceaseless prayer. It was the voice of God. And that voice was asking him to return precisely to the place of his pain, to walk again through the land that had seen him suffer, to carry the light of Christ to the very men who had once treated him as a work animal. There are places in your past that frighten you. There are wounds you do not want to revisit, memories you have locked away in some deep corner of your mind because looking at them again feels unbearable. Perhaps it was a relationship that undid you. Perhaps it is a failure that still brings shame. Perhaps it is a season of your life you would erase entirely if you could. But sometimes God asks us to return precisely there, not to suffer again, but to heal. Not to relive the pain, but to transform it. Not to remain trapped in the past, but to bring to that past the light we did not have when we first lived through it. That is exactly what God asked of Patrick. And Patrick, with a courage that can only be born from the deepest faith, obeyed. The decision was neither easy nor celebrated. Other bishops criticized him. They accused him of being unworthy, of lacking sufficient formation, of seeking to enrich himself at the expense of the pagans. Patrick himself acknowledges in his Confessio that his Latin was imperfect, that he lacked the eloquence of other clerics, that his education had been interrupted by his years of captivity. But none of it stopped him. Patrick knew something his critics could not understand, that God does not call the equipped, he equips the called, that the eloquence of the soul is worth more than the eloquence of words, that a man who has prayed 100 times a day for 6 years on a mountain carries a spiritual authority that no seminary can bestow. And so, probably around the year 432, Patrick returned to Ireland, not as a slave, but as a bishop. Not as a captive, but as a missionary, not in chains, but carrying the gospel. And with him, he carried something that had not yet taken the form of a written prayer, but that already lived in his heart as an unshakable truth. That Christ was with him, before him, behind him, within him, above him, beneath him, to his right and to his left. That the presence of God surrounded him like an invisible breastplate, and that no Druid, no pagan king, no force of darkness could penetrate that armor of faith. Ireland was waiting, and the most important night of his mission was about to begin. The Hill of Tara and the Sacred Fire. Ireland, in the 5th century, was a world apart, a world Rome never conquered, that no legionary ever entered as an invader, that no stone road ever crossed from coast to coast. While the rest of Western Europe crumbled beneath the weight of a failing empire, Ireland remained intact. Wild, ancient, governed by laws that had existed before Rome, was even a thought in the minds of its founders. It was an island of deep forests and green valleys, of dark rivers winding between hills covered in grass and moss, of enormous skies that changed color with every hour, shifting from leaden gray to deep blue, from the pale gold of dawn to the burning purple of dusk, as though the sky itself were a living thing that breathed and transformed with every heartbeat of the day. The island was divided into more than 150 small kingdoms called Tuatha, each governed by a Ree, a warrior chief whose authority extended over his clan and his land, but who in turn owed loyalty to more powerful provincial kings, who in turn acknowledged the symbolic supremacy of an Ard Ree, a high king, whose ancestral seat was found in a place the Irish held sacred, with a sacredness older than any temple, deeper than any altar, the Hill of Tara. Tara was not an imposing mountain, nor a walled fortress. Seen from the outside, it was barely a gentle rise in the heart of present-day County Meath, a green hill, like so many green hills in Ireland, modest in height, unassuming in appearance. But what made Tara extraordinary was not its size. It was what Tara represented. For the Irish of that age, Tara was the navel of the world, the axis around which all of reality turned, the exact point where heaven and earth touched, where the visible and the invisible met, where past, present, and future converged in one sacred place. There the great assemblies were held. There the kings were crowned. There the Druids performed their most solemn rituals, consulting the gods, reading the signs of the sky, pronouncing prophecies that decided the fate of entire people. From the summit of Tara, on a clear day, the landscape spread in every direction. Rolling fields, distant forests, rivers glinting like silver ribbons under the sun. And whoever sat upon the stone of destiny, the Lia File, that ceremonial rock that according to legend cried out when the true king touched it, could feel beneath his feet the vibration of all Ireland, as though the island itself were a living organism and Tara were its beating heart. The High King in Patrick's time was Lorica, son of Niall of the Nine Hostages, a powerful monarch whose lineage stretched back through generations of warriors and conquerors. His father, Niall, had been one of the great kings of Ireland, a man whose fame had crossed the sea, whose raids along the coasts of Britannia had filled the Irish ships with slaves and plunder. It is not impossible, in fact, that one of the expeditions ordered or inspired by Niall had been precisely the one that, decades earlier, had torn young Maywin Succat from his home on the western coast of Britannia. History carries those terrible and beautiful ironies. The son of the man who may have been responsible for Patrick's enslavement would now be the king Patrick must face with the gospel. Lorica was no ignorant barbarian. He was a shrewd king, a skilled politician, a man who understood the delicate balance of power on an island fragmented into dozens of rival clans. His authority rested not only on the strength of his warriors, who were many and loyal, nor on the extent of his lands, which were vast and fertile, but on something more subtle and more profound: the legitimacy granted him by the Druids, the pagan priests, who were the true guardians of Ireland's spiritual and social order. The Druids. We must pause a moment on them, because without understanding who they were and what they represented, the magnitude of what Patrick was about to do cannot be grasped. The Druids were not simple priests or simple sorcerers. They were the most powerful men in Irish society, more powerful in many ways than the kings themselves. They were judges, counsellors, historians, poets, physicians, astronomers, and theologians, all at once. They controlled the law, because the traditional laws of Ireland, known as the Breon laws, were transmitted orally by the Druids from generation to generation. They controlled education, because only they possessed the knowledge needed to interpret the mysteries of the world. They controlled the calendar, because they determined when the sacred feasts were to be celebrated, when it was propitious to sow or to harvest, when it was favourable to go to war or to make peace. And they controlled access to the divine, because only they knew how to communicate with the gods, how to appease their anger, how to invoke their favour, how to read their messages in the flight of birds, in the shape of clouds, in the flames of the ritual fire. They knew the secrets of nature. They commanded enchantments that, according to the chronicles, could alter the weather, summon mist, or bring darkness down upon the land in the middle of the day. They practiced divination by reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, by interpreting dreams, by observing the stars on nights of new moon. They were regarded as intermediaries between the visible world and the invisible, between men and gods, between light and darkness. Their word could raise a man to the throne or cast him into disgrace. Their curse was feared more than the sword of any warrior. Their approval was required for any enterprise of consequence, from a wedding to a battle, from the building of a fort to the choosing of a successor. To challenge the Druids was to challenge the very order of the universe as the Irish understood it. It was to defy centuries of tradition, centuries of belief, centuries of a spiritual system so deeply woven into the daily life of the island that attempting to uproot it was like attempting to pull the roots from a 1,000-year-old oak. It was something no sane person would attempt. It was, in every sense, a form of death. And yet that is exactly what Patrick prepared to do. For Patrick, arriving in Ireland with a small company of companions, monks and clerics who had crossed the sea with him from Gaul and Britannia, understood that to bring the gospel to the whole island, he needed to reach the very centre of pagan power. It was not enough to convert a few villagers on the coast. It was not enough to baptize isolated families in the remote western valleys. It was not enough to plant small Christian communities that lived at the margins of power, hidden and harmless. If he wanted to transform Ireland, if he wanted to fulfill the mandate the voices of the Irish had given him, in that dream that changed his life, he needed to confront the Druids on their own ground, to challenge the king on his own hill, to kindle the light of Christ in the very heart of the darkness. Consider what that meant for a man who had been a slave on that same soil. Patrick knew Ireland. He knew it from the inside, from the bottom, from the perspective of one who has no power at all, who is another man's property, who has slept in the open and eaten the leavings of others. He knew the strength of the Druids because he had witnessed it with his own eyes during his 6 years of captivity. He knew the power of the clan chiefs because he had been one of their slaves. He knew the ferocity of the Irish warriors because it was they who had torn him from his home. He was not going in blind. He was not a naive missionary arriving in an unknown land with no understanding of what awaited him. He knew exactly what awaited him. He knew he might die. He knew the Druids had both the motive and the power to destroy him. And he went anyway. He walked toward Tara anyway. He lit his fire anyway. There is something profoundly moving in that courage. Something that goes beyond military bravery or reckless daring. It is the courage of faith. The courage of one who has discovered something so real, so true, so luminous, that no fear, however great, can compete with that light. Patrick was not a legendary hero without fear or doubt. He was a real man, with real scars, with memories of slavery that must have haunted him each time he saw the mountains where he had tended sheep for 6 long years. But his faith was greater than his fear. His God was greater than his memories. And the voice that had called him back to Ireland was stronger than all the voices of the past that cried out for him to flee. Perhaps tonight you, too, are facing something that feels too large. Perhaps there is a challenge in your life that rises before you the way the Hill of Tara rose before Patrick. A problem that seems insurmountable, a situation that makes you feel small and powerless, a fear that paralyzes you when the lights go out and the mind begins to turn without stopping. If so, I want you to remember this. The man who changed the spiritual history of an entire island was a former slave who spoke imperfect Latin and carried no weapon but a prayer. It was not his eloquence that defeated the Druids, not his physical strength, nor his political cunning. It was his faith, his willingness to take one more step when everything told him to stop, his blind trust that the God who had brought him out of slavery would not abandon him before the powers of darkness. And that is exactly what he did. The tradition places the decisive moment during the pagan feast of Beltane, one of the 4 great festivals of the Celtic calendar, alongside Samhain, Imbolc, and Lugnasad. Beltane marked the beginning of summer, the moment when cattle were driven to the high pastures, when the earth woke from its winter sleep and opened toward fertility and abundance. It was a feast of fire, because fire was, for the Celts, the most sacred of elements, the symbol of the sun, of life, of the divine power that sustained the world. Great bonfires were lit on the hills of all Ireland, and the cattle were driven between the flames as a ritual of purification, to drive away sickness and draw good fortune. But before any fire could be kindled anywhere on the island, a sacred protocol had to be observed. On that night, the night of Beltane, every fire in Ireland had to be extinguished. Every home, every village, every fort, every dwelling had to put out its flame. The entire island had to sink into darkness, a total, absolute, ceremonial darkness, as though the earth itself were holding its breath in anticipation of a new birth. And then, only then, the ritual fire of the king was to be kindled on the hill of Tara. And from that sacred flame, that primordial fire representing the authority of the Ard Rí and his bond with the gods, all the other fires of the island would be lit, one by one, from hill to hill, like a chain of light extending from the heart of Ireland to its most distant coasts. No flame could burn anywhere in Ireland before the king's, not one. It was a sacred law, and its violation was punishable by death, for the king's fire represented his authority, his connection with the gods, his power over the land and over his people. To kindle a fire before the royal flame was a direct challenge to the throne, a declaration of spiritual war, an act of defiance so profound it was equivalent to saying, "There is a power greater than yours. There is a flame that burns before yours. There is an authority that surpasses that of any earthly king." Picture that night. Picture all of Ireland sunk in darkness. Picture the black fields, the silent forests, the villages without light, the houses where families waited in shadow, eyes turned toward Tara, waiting for the moment when the first spark would appear on the sacred hill and the chain of fire could begin. Picture the silence. Picture the expectation. Picture that instant of complete darkness before the light. That moment weighted with ritual meaning when the entire island united in a single gesture of obedience to the king and to the gods. And now picture this. In the middle of that absolute darkness, a flame appears in the wrong place. Not on Tara, not on the king's sacred hill. On another hill, near, visible, unmistakable. On the Hill of Slane, a few miles from Tara, across the valley of the River Boyne, that liquid vein that wound through the heart of the plain like a thread of silver beneath the moon, a small but steady light began to burn. At first, it was barely an orange glow, a tiny point that someone might have mistaken for a low star on the horizon. But the flame grew. It fed itself. It became larger, brighter, more defiant, until it could no longer be ignored, until everyone looking out from Tara could see it with perfect clarity, etched against the dark Irish sky. Patrick had lit the Easter fire. It was the eve of the Christian Passover, the most sacred night in the calendar of the church. The night when Christians throughout the world celebrate, and still celebrate, the resurrection of Christ, the final victory of light over darkness, of life over death, of love over hatred, of hope over despair. And Patrick, with his monks kneeling around him, with the wind of the Irish night stirring their habits, with the vastness of the starred sky as his only witness besides God, had decided that the fire of Christ would burn before the fire of the King, that the light of the gospel would rise over Ireland before any other flame, that on that night, on that hill, before the eyes of an entire nation submerged in darkness, he would declare, with a gesture more eloquent than any sermon, that a new authority had arrived, a new king, a new light, that no human power and no force of darkness could extinguish. Patrick knew what he was doing. It was not a mistake, not an oversight, not the impulsive act of a careless missionary who did not understand local customs. He understood those customs intimately. He had lived among them for 6 years as a slave. He knew perfectly well that lighting a fire before the king was an act punishable by death, and he did it anyway. He did it because he understood that there are moments when faith demands a visible gesture, a concrete act, a public declaration that leaves no room for ambiguity. Moments when it is not enough to believe in silence, to pray in private, to keep faith as a secret that belongs only to oneself. There are moments when the light must be seen, must be set high, must shine before all people, as Jesus said, so that they may see the good works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. And that flame on the Hill of Slane burned with an intensity that transcended the physical. It burned with the intensity of 15 centuries of Irish Christianity that were about to be born. It burned with the intensity of thousands of monasteries, millions of prayers, countless souls who would be touched by the faith of one man who dared to kindle a fire in the darkness. When Lorica saw that distant light burning on Slane, he rose in fury. The fury of a challenged king is a terrible thing, and the fury of a 5th century Irish king, surrounded by armed warriors and indignant Druids, was something that would have made the bravest man tremble. Lorica turned to his Druids, to those counsellors in whom he placed all his spiritual trust, and demanded to know what that flame meant, who had dared to light it, and what punishment the transgressor should receive. The Druids, shaken, looked at the light burning on Slane and felt something they had rarely felt before. Fear. Not the fear of a man before a physical threat, but the deep, visceral, instinctive fear of one who senses that the world as he knows it is about to change forever. And they warned the king with prophetic words that some accounts have preserved, words that rang through the hall of Tara like the echo of an irrevocable sentence. O king, if this fire is not quenched tonight, it will never be quenched. It will surpass all our fires, and he who has kindled it will overcome us all and overcome you, and all the men of your kingdom will be drawn to him, and his kingdom will have no end. Listen to those, hear them carefully, because they are one of the most extraordinary prophecies in all of Christian history, spoken not by a biblical prophet, nor by a saint of the church, but by the very enemies of the faith, by the pagan Druids, who, in their dark wisdom, in their knowledge of the invisible forces, knew how to recognize that the flame on Slane was no ordinary fire. It was the fire of something that could not be stopped. It was the fire of a truth that could not be extinguished. It was the fire of a God whose power surpassed everything they had ever known. And they were right. That fire was never quenched. 15 centuries later, it is still burning. The king gathered his warriors, 27 war chariots according to some accounts, and set out for Slane to confront the one who had dared to defy his authority. The Druids accompanied him, eager to measure their power against that of the stranger who had kindled a forbidden flame. The royal procession advanced through the dark valley separating Tara from Slane, crossing the river Boyne, following the glow of the fire that burned on the hill like a fallen star. The horses breathed heavily in the cold night. The wheels of the war chariots groaned over the wet earth. The armor of the warriors rang with every step. It was a procession of earthly power moving toward an encounter with a power of another nature entirely. The Druids had given instructions to the king. When they arrived at Slane, no one was to rise to receive the stranger, for to rise in his presence would be to show him respect, and to show him respect would be to give him power. But when Patrick appeared before the royal procession, walking calmly from his fire toward the assembled warriors and Druids, with the serenity of one who has nothing to fear because he knows who protects him, one of the king's men, a nobleman named Urk, rose to his feet. He could not help it. Something in Patrick's bearing, something in the light of his eyes, something in the supernatural peace that emanated from that man dressed in a simple habit, compelled him to stand, the way a man stands before something sacred, something true, something his deepest instincts recognize even when every aspect of his upbringing tells him he should not. Urk, according to tradition, would later become one of Patrick's first disciples. What followed was an encounter that the Irish chronicles narrate with the drama of an epic battle, though the only weapon Patrick carried was his faith. He bore no sword, no bronze shield, no ashwood spear, no coat of mail like those worn by the warriors surrounding him. His armor was invisible, his shield was a prayer, his sword was the word of God. The Druids attempted to stop him with their enchantments. They tried to darken the sky, drawing a black curtain across the stars. calling upon the night itself to grow thicker, heavier, more oppressive. They tried to summon storms, to call down thunder and lightning, to unleash the forces of nature against the missionary, against that solitary man who dared to defy the ancient order of the island. They tried to bury him in snow, to surround him in darkness, to drown him in the terror that their incantations provoked in those who witnessed them. That primitive fear of the dark forces that the Druids had wielded as an instrument of control for centuries. That ancestral dread that had kept the people of Ireland under their sway. But nothing worked. The darkness the Druids summoned dissolved before Patrick's presence, the way mist dissolves before the sun. The enchantments broke against something invisible that surrounded him, something the Druids could feel but could not penetrate, something stronger than any incantation they had ever pronounced. Patrick remained firm, praying, invoking the true God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, facing the power of the Druids with the only force that is greater than any spell, the presence of Christ. The traditional accounts tell that one of the most powerful Druids, named Lorica, attempted to blaspheme against the Christian faith before the king, and was lifted into the air by an invisible force and cast to the ground where he died. Another Druid, Maywin, challenged Patrick to a contest of powers, but was overcome when Patrick invoked the fire of heaven. These accounts, embellished, no doubt, by centuries of oral tradition and by the natural tendency of medieval hagiographers to magnify the deeds of their saints, tell us something essential, even if we do not take them as literal reportage, that the confrontation between Patrick and the Druids was real, was intense, was decisive, and that Patrick, against every human probability, prevailed. And it was in the midst of that confrontation, in the heart of that night where the light of the Easter fire competed with the darkness of Druidic enchantment, where the voice of a solitary missionary rose against the voices of an entire religious system 1,000 years old, where the faith of a former slave measured itself against the power of the most feared priests on the island. It was then, according to tradition, that Patrick prayed for the first time the words that would become the most. It was then that the breastplate took form, that the invisible armor of faith became word, that the protection of God crystallized into a prayer that would cross the centuries like a sword of light, capable of cutting through any darkness. For Patrick knew he was not fighting against men. He knew his battle was not against Lorica or the Druids as persons, not against flesh and blood, as St. Paul would write in his letter to the Ephesians, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. He understood, with the clarity that comes from 6 years of unceasing prayer on a solitary mountain, that behind the spells of the Druids there was something larger and older than the Druids themselves. Something dark, something that hated the light, something that fed on the fear and superstition of peoples, something that could not be defeated with theological arguments or eloquent speeches, but only with the power of the name of Christ invoked with total, absolute, unconditional faith. And for that battle he needed an armor that would not rust with time, would not crack under the blows of the enemy, could not be penetrated by any enchantment, any spell, any curse, any conjuring whispered in the dark. He needed an armor that covered every direction, every flank, every vulnerable angle. He needed the armor of God. He needed the breastplate. And so Patrick opened his mouth and prayed. And the words that came from his lips that night were not words composed by a theologian in the silence of his study, nor by a poet at the comfort of his writing table. They were words forged in the fire of lived experience, born from 6 years of prayer on a mountain, tempered by the pain of slavery, washed by the rain of 1,000 shelterless nights, honed by the most absolute solitude a human being can know. They were the words of a man who understood what it meant to be unprotected, who knew vulnerability in its most raw form, and who had discovered that the only true protection does not come from walls or armies, but from the name of Christ spoken in faith. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity. I believe in the threeness. I confess the oneness of the Creator of creation. With those words, spoken in the Irish tongue he had learned during his years of captivity, in the language the raiders had taught him by force, and that God was now transforming into an instrument of salvation. Patrick walked toward Tara. He walked with his monks behind him, a small group of unarmed men advancing through the night toward the center of the oldest pagan power on the island. He walked toward the Druids and their enchantments. He walked toward the king and his warriors. He walked into the darkness with the light of Christ as his only protection, with the invisible breastplate settled over his soul, with every direction covered by the name of the one who is stronger than any darkness. And the darkness did not prevail. The deer in the mist. What happened that night, as Patrick and his monks walked from the Hill of Slane toward Tara, is one of the most beautiful and mysterious episodes in all of Christian hagiography. A story that has been told and retold for over 1,500 years, that has inspired hymns and paintings and prayers, that has been translated into dozens of languages and repeated on the lips of millions of people who sought comfort in the darkness. And tonight, I want to tell it to you with all the slowness and reverence it deserves, because I believe it carries a message you need to hear, a message that crosses the centuries precisely to reach you, precisely on this night, precisely at this moment in your life, when perhaps you need to believe that there is a protection you cannot see, but that is more real than anything you can touch. The tradition tells us that King Lorica, furious at Patrick's defiance, furious at that forbidden flame that had burned on Slane before his own, furious that a stranger had dared to challenge the sacred order of his kingdom, sent warriors to intercept him on the road. Not ordinary soldiers, his finest men, the fiercest of his warriors, those who had fought in bloody raids against rival clans, who knew the island's terrain like the palm of their own hand, who knew how to lay ambushes that never failed, how to wait in the dark with the patience of a predator, how to strike with the swiftness of lightning the moment their prey least expected. The Druids had warned the king with words weighted with urgency. That man and his fire had to be stopped at any cost, not because he was a warrior or represented a military threat, but because if he reached Tara with his message, if he managed to plant the seed of Christianity in the very heart of pagan power, the power of the ancient gods would be shaken forever. The Druids sensed, with that deep instinct that had made them feared for centuries, that something was changing, that the ground beneath their feet was no longer as firm as before, that the forces which had governed Ireland since time immemorial were about to face an enemy they could not defeat with enchantments or rituals. And so the soldiers took their positions along the road. They chose the spot with care, a stretch of path crossing a small valley between two hills, where the way narrowed and a group of travelers had nowhere to flee, hemmed in by the wilderness itself, by thick forest on one side and a steep drop on the other. They hid among the bushes, behind rocks thick with moss, among the ferns growing wild in the damp Irish earth. They became one with the darkness, the way only men who have hunted since childhood can. Men who know the forest as their own home, who can remain utterly still for hours, waiting for the precise moment to strike. And they waited. They waited in the darkness of the night, in the sharp cold that Irish spring brings when the sun goes down and the temperature drops quickly, in a silence broken only by the distant croaking of frogs in the marshes and the occasional cry of an owl in some nearby tree. They waited with their weapons ready, their spears in hand, their eyes adjusted to the dark, scanning the road along which the missionary must come. They waited to capture him, or perhaps for something worse, for the king's fury knew no mercy, and neither did his soldiers. But Patrick sensed the danger. He was not a naive or guileless man. He was a former slave who had survived 6 years in the mountains of Ireland, who had learned to read the signs of the land, to feel the presence of others before seeing them, to perceive the tension in the air when something was wrong. And that night, walking with his monks toward the encounter with the king, he could feel it. He could feel it in the air. That tension that precedes an attack, that unnatural stillness that settles when something threatening is near. When invisible eyes watch from the darkness, he could sense that the road ahead was not as empty as it should have been, that something lurked in the shadows, that death perhaps waited beyond the next bend in the path. And in that moment, with the certainty of one who has been called by God and knows that calling cannot be frustrated by any mortal warrior. Patrick did what he had learned to do on the mountain during 6 years of captivity. When the solitude pressed against his chest like a fist of iron, he prayed, not the way a dutiful believer prays to fulfill a religious obligation, not the way a desperate man prays, hoping God will solve his problems while he does nothing. Prayed the way one prays when there is no other option, when prayer is both the last resort and the first, when one has learned through lived experience that God listens, that his presence is more real than any threat. And he did not pray just any prayer. He prayed the breastplate. He prayed the words he had shaped in his heart during those years of solitude on the mountain. Words he had refined the way a jeweler refines a precious stone. Words that invoke the presence of Christ in every direction, above and below, before and behind, to the right and to the left, at every compass point of the soul, and in every corner of his being. He prayed the words that called upon the protection of the Trinity, the shield of the Father, the redemption of the Son, the guidance of the Holy Spirit. He prayed the words that summoned the strength of heaven, the light of the sun hidden that night but certain to return at dawn, the steadiness of the rock that no storm can move, the power of the sea that no barrier can contain, the swiftness of lightning that illuminates the whole sky in an instant, the way faith illuminates the soul in the precise moment it is needed. He prayed with the intensity of one whose life depends on every syllable, with the faith of one who has known through years of daily and nightly prayer that God hears, that God answers, that God is present even when he seems most absent, especially when he seems most absent. He prayed with the confidence of one who wears an armor no human eye can see, but that is more resistant than any iron shield, more impenetrable than any coat of mail, more lasting than any fortification built by human hands. He prayed knowing that the breastplate was not an illusion or a symbol or a metaphor, but a spiritual reality as solid as the rocks of the road, as true as the air he breathed, as present as the danger that threatened him. And then the miracle occurred. The Liber Hymnorum, the ancient Irish book of hymns that preserves the text of the breastplate, that precious manuscript which has survived 15 centuries of history, of invasions and burnings and wars and revolutions, includes a note explaining what happened that night, in words that seem written by someone who was there, who saw what occurred, who could scarcely believe what his eyes were showing him. St. Patrick chanted this hymn when an ambush was laid to prevent his arrival at Tara, and it appeared to those lying in wait that they, Patrick and his monks, were a wild deer followed by a fawn. A wild deer followed by a fawn. That is what the ambushing soldiers saw. That is what the eyes of Lorica's warriors, hardened men who had seen everything, who had fought in battles and raids, who were not easily frightened, registered in their bewildered minds. Not a group of monks walking along the path, not men in simple habits, nor a bishop with his staff, nor a stranger with his small company of companions. What they saw was a beautiful stag, one of those deer that roam the forests of Ireland, with his branching antlers spread like a living crown, his dark coat gleaming beneath the moonlight filtering through the clouds, moving serenely through the night mist as though he were lord of the forest, as though the night belonged to him, as though nothing in the world could touch him. And behind the stag, trotting with the lightness of youth, came a fawn, a small one, perhaps born that very spring, with its long legs still a little unsteady, its dark eyes reflecting the starlight, following the adult male with the blind confidence of one who knows it is protected, who has nothing to fear while the greater one is near. The ambushing soldiers stared and could not believe what they were seeing. A deer? Here, on this road, at this hour of the night. A deer and a fawn passing quietly through the very bushes where they crouched with their weapons ready. What was happening? Was it a sign from the gods? Was it an ill omen? Were they dreaming, or were they awake? The soldiers let them pass. How could they attack a deer? What threat could an animal of the field pose, walking calmly through the mist as though the Irish night were simply a forest, and those creatures nothing more than wildlife following their natural path beneath the stars. There was no reason to intervene, no reason to shatter the calm of that apparently ordinary scene, the simple sight of wild creatures moving through a spring night in Ireland. And so, the ambush failed. The warriors of Lorica, the king's finest men, the most expert hunters on the island, let their prey pass without knowing it was their prey, without knowing that the deer crossing the road before their eyes was in reality the man they had come to stop, the stranger who defied the king, the missionary who carried a fire they could not extinguish. Patrick and his companions passed through the danger untouched, wrapped in the protection of God like a sacred mist, transformed in the eyes of their enemies into something entirely other than what they were, invisible, untouchable, shielded by a power that no sword can cut and no arrow can pierce. There is something in this episode that has always moved me deeply. Not only the miracle itself, extraordinary as it is the detail of the faun. Patrick was not transformed alone. His monks were transformed with him. The entire group, that small company of companions who had crossed the sea with him, who had left their homes and families to follow him into a strange and dangerous land, were wrapped together in that same sacred mist, were included in that same protection, were seen by the eyes of their enemies as a deer and a faun, two creatures that move together, that belong to one another, that are never separated. That tells me something beautiful about Patrick's faith. It tells me that he did not pray only for himself, that when he sensed the danger and opened his mouth to invoke the protection of God, he did not think first of his own survival, did not ask that he escape the danger while the others fended for themselves. He prayed for all of them. He included his monks in the breastplate. He placed each one of them beneath the shield of Christ with the same intensity with which he placed himself. And God, in his mercy, answered that prayer of communion, that faith that was not individualistic but communal, and transformed the whole group together, made them invisible together, protected them together, brought them through the danger together. Tonight, as you listen to these words, I want you to remember that the breastplate does not protect you alone. It protects you together with those you love, together with those who walk beside you in faith, together with your community, your family, your friends who are also seeking the light in the darkness. The protection of God is not a private shelter, but a shared sanctuary, a stronghold where there is room for all of us, where no one is left outside, where the sacred mist enfolds everyone who chooses to walk beneath the name of Christ. This episode gave the breastplate its other name, its original name in Old Irish, Fiaith Fiada. For a long time, medieval scholars translated that name as the deer's cry, reading the story of the deer as a direct etymological explanation. But modern scholars, looking more precisely at the Old Irish, have arrived at a more nuanced, more profound, more accurate interpretation. Fiaith Fiada, according to linguists, means more precisely spell of concealment or mist of protection, an expression that describes exactly what happened that night. Not simply that Patrick and his monks were transformed into deer, but that they were wrapped in something that hid them, that made them invisible, that caused them to pass unnoticed, that made them disappear from the sight of those who sought to harm them. The mist, that is what protected them. Not a literal transformation of men into animals, though that is what the soldiers saw and what the tradition recounts. What truly occurred was that God enveloped his own in a veil of concealment, in a sacred mist that descended over the road the way mist descends over the Irish valleys when the sun goes down and the earth releases the warmth of the day. That mist, for the soldiers lying in wait in the darkness, was enough to erase the outline of the monks, to blur their edges, to make what they saw only the vaguely recognizable silhouette of forest animals, not men with intentions or purposes. For Patrick and his monks, on the other hand, the mist was not an obstacle but a shield. It did not blind them or confuse them. They could walk with clarity, with direction, with purpose, passing through the danger without seeing the danger, without feeling the fear they would surely have felt had they seen the gleaming weapons and fierce faces of the warriors positioned along the road. The mist of God was their protection, their concealment, their salvation. Tonight, as you listen to these words, I want you to picture that sacred mist enfolding you as well. I want you to picture the same protection that covered Patrick and his monks on that dark road toward Tara, covering you right now, in your room, in your bed, in this very moment when the hours stretch long and sleep perhaps does not come, and the mind begins to drift into territories you would rather avoid. Picture a mist around you, a mist that is not cold or damp but warm, soft, comforting. A mist that is in truth the presence of God surrounding you, protecting you, concealing you from everything that wishes to do you harm. The fears that lie in wait for you tonight, the anxieties that hide like ambushing soldiers in the corners of your mind, the dark thoughts that wait for a moment of vulnerability to strike. All of them look toward where you are, and they cannot see you. They search for a man, for a woman, for a human being made of flesh and blood, fragile, breakable, vulnerable. And what they see instead is only a deer walking serenely through the mist, only a fawn trotting behind, sheltered by the presence of the Greater One. Only the peace of God wrapping a space they cannot enter, where their arrows cannot reach, where their weapons are useless. Because the breastplate is not merely a prayer of the 5th century, not merely a historical document, a literary relic, an ancient hymn to be studied in books of theology and admired for its linguistic beauty while its power is ignored. The breastplate is a living prayer, a shield that still works, a protection with no expiration date, one that does not wear down with use, that does not lose its strength with the passing of centuries or the changing of cultures or the shifting of languages. Every time someone prays, "Christ with me," "Christ before me," "Christ behind me," that same mist of protection descends. That same shield is raised, that same invisible breastplate settles around the soul of the one who invokes it, sealing every crack, closing every gate, protecting every flank. The Druids of Tara could not stop Patrick that night. They had all the power of the ancient world, all the wisdom of centuries of tradition, every charm and spell and curse at their disposal, and none of it worked. The sacred mist was stronger. The presence of Christ was more powerful. The breastplate prevailed. And whatever is pursuing you tonight, whatever is stealing your sleep, whatever makes you feel vulnerable and exposed in the darkness, it will not stop you either, because the same prayer that protected a saint on an Irish road over 1500 years ago, the same prayer that made him invisible to his enemies, the same prayer that transformed him into a deer before armed soldiers, that same prayer is protecting you right now, in this very moment, as you listen to these words, as your body rests in the bed, as the night enfolds your room in its mantle of silence. The deer is still walking through the mist. It has not stopped walking in 15 centuries. It has never stopped. Every time someone prays the breastplate, the deer resumes its gentle progress, passes through the dark forest, moves past the enemies who cannot see it, continues on its way toward Tara, toward the light, toward the dawn that inevitably comes. And you, tonight, are part of that procession. You are walking with Patrick. You are shielded by the same mist. You are wrapped in the same protection. You are safe. Christ with me, the anatomy of the breastplate. Now I want us to travel together into the interior of the prayer itself, to open the breastplate the way one opens an ancient chest filled with jewels, to examine each of its parts with the reverence of one who holds in his hands something sacred, something that has been touched by millions of praying lips across the centuries, something that has been whispered in moments of terror and of hope, in nights of sleeplessness and in dawns of gratitude, in monastic cells and on fields of battle, in hospitals and in homes, in every place where a human heart has needed to feel protected. St. Patrick's breastplate, as it has come down to us through the Liber Hymnorum and other medieval manuscripts, is an extensive poem divided into several sections, each invoking a different source of protection. Scholars believe that the written version we know dates linguistically from the 8th century. though tradition attributes it firmly to Patrick and to the episode of the ambush on the road to Tara in the year 433. Whatever its exact date of composition, the prayer belongs to a genre known in the Celtic tradition as a Lorica, a Latin word meaning literally breastplate or armour for the chest, a form of protective prayer that was deeply beloved in the Irish monasteries of the early Celtic Christian centuries. Other Loricas were attributed to saints such as Dalan Fogail and Saint Fursa, but none achieved the fame or the spiritual depth of Patrick's breastplate. The prayer opens with a declaration of intent that rings like a spiritual battle cry. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity. The key word in the original Irish is atam ruig, which scholars translate as I bind myself or I unite myself. This is not a passive prayer. It is not the prayer of someone sitting down, waiting for protection to fall from heaven. It is the prayer of a spiritual warrior who rises, who stands upright, who makes the conscious and active decision to bind himself to God, to fasten himself to the Trinity, the way a soldier fastens his breastplate to his chest before entering battle. Patrick does not ask for protection the way one asks a favor. He claims it the way one exercises a right, the right of every child of God to be covered by the shield of his Father. After invoking the Trinity, the prayer unfolds its protection in successive layers, like armor being placed on the body piece by piece. The second section invokes the power of the life of Christ, the strength of his incarnation, his baptism, his crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, his return at the end of time. Each of these mysteries is presented as a source of protective power, as though every moment of Christ's life were a different shield, layered one upon another to create an impenetrable defense. The incarnation protects because God became flesh and knows our fragility from the inside. The baptism protects because the waters of grace wash every impurity clean. The crucifixion protects because the blood of Christ sealed forever the defeat of evil. The resurrection protects because death no longer has the final word. The ascension protects because Christ is now at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us. And the final return protects because we know that history has an ending, and that ending is the justice and the mercy of God. The third section of the breastplate widens the circle of protection, invoking the celestial beings and the saints, the love of the seraphim, the obedience of the angels, the ministry of the archangels, the prayers of the patriarchs, the words of the prophets, the preaching of the apostles, the faith of the confessors, the purity of the holy virgins, the deeds of the righteous. Patrick does not protect himself alone. He surrounds himself with an invisible army, with a communion of saints that spans the whole history of salvation, from the angels who encircle the throne of God, to the men and women of faith who walk before us and who now intercede from glory. But perhaps the most beautiful section, the most original, the most deeply Celtic of the entire breastplate, is the fourth, where Patrick invokes the forces of creation itself, the power of heaven, the light of the sun, the brilliance of fire, the swiftness of lightning, the lightness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. Here, the heart of Celtic Christianity reveals itself. That spiritual tradition which saw the presence of God not only in temples and in scripture, but in every element of nature, in every creature, in every force of the universe. For Patrick, who had spent 6 years in the open air exposed to every element, creation was not a decorative backdrop. It was the visible language of an invisible God, a cathedral without walls, whose columns were the trees and whose roof was the sky. The fifth section lifts the prayer to a tender intimacy, invoking the attributes of God directly. The strength of God to pilot me, the power of God to sustain me, the wisdom of God to guide me, the eye of God to look before me, the ear of God to hear me, the word of God to speak for me, the hand of God to guard me, the way of God to lie before me, the shield of God to protect me, the host of God to save me. Each line is the Father's hand resting gently on the face of his child. Each invocation is a reminder that we are not alone, that every aspect of our life is covered by a corresponding aspect of divine protection. And then comes the sixth section, where the prayer names explicitly the dangers against which the breastplate is raised, the spells of false prophets, the black laws of paganism, the false laws of heresy, the works of idolatry, the enchantments of witches and sorcerers. Patrick was not naive. He did not pretend the darkness did not exist. He named it directly, looked it in the eye, identified it with surgical precision, and then declared that none of those forces held any power over the one who wears the armor of God. The seventh section is brief and direct, like the thrust of a sword. Christ, protect me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that I may receive abundant reward. It is the soldier's prayer before battle, the sailor's before the storm, the traveler's before the unknown road. And finally, the eighth section, the heart within the heart, the jewel inside the chest, the words that have resonated in millions of souls across 15 centuries, and that tonight resonate for you. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. There is no direction left unguarded, no flank without protection, no above or below, before or behind, right or left, that is not sealed by the presence of Christ. The breastplate is total. The breastplate is complete. The breastplate is perfect. It leaves no space for fear to enter, no gap through which anxiety can slip, no back door through which nightmares can creep into your sleep. Christ with me, right now, in this very instant. Christ before me, covering everything that is coming, everything tomorrow will bring, everything unknown that awaits you when you wake. Christ behind me, healing everything you have left behind, closing the wounds of the past, guarding your back against the memories that try to ambush you by surprise. Christ within me, dwelling in the deepest part of your being, in that secret place only God can enter, where your soul breathes, where your truest self lives and rests. Christ beneath me, supporting the ground you walk on, bearing the weight of your weary body, being the foundation upon which everything else is built. Christ above me, like a sky of mercy, like a roof of grace that no storm can bring down. Christ on my right and on my left, closing every side, covering every flank, ensuring that nothing reaches you from any direction. This is the breastplate of St. Patrick. This is the armor he wore on the road to Tara that night. And this is the armor you are wearing now. As you listen to these words, as your body sinks gently into the bed, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows and deepens, rest now. The breastplate is on. The night deepens around you, but nothing in that darkness can reach where you are. The serpents and the shamrock. The morning after the failed ambush, when the sacred mist had lifted and the spring sun began to pour its pale light over the green fields of Meath, Patrick arrived at Tara. He came walking, with his monks behind him, the dust of the road on his feet, and the peace of God on his face. He did not arrive the way a conqueror arrives, on horseback with banners. He did not arrive the way an ambassador arrives, with gifts and diplomatic promises. He arrived the way a man arrives who has nothing to offer but the truth, and who knows that the truth, when it is true, needs no ornament, no escort, no demonstration of force. He presented himself before King Lorica and before the Druids, before the entire assembled court gathered on the sacred hill, before the clan chiefs who had come from all over Ireland for the feast of Beltane, before the warriors who the night before had sought him and could not find him, before the soldiers who had seen a deer where there should have been a man. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary spiritual confrontations in the history of Christianity. An encounter that the Irish chronicles describe with a drama that still raises the hairs on the back of the neck 15 centuries later. The traditional accounts gathered in texts such as the Vita Tripartita, the three-part biography compiled centuries after Patrick's death from older oral traditions, and in the Annals of the Four Masters, describe confrontations between Patrick and the Druids that recall the contests between Moses and the magicians of Pharaoh in the Book of Exodus. Signs and wonders, manifestations of spiritual power that made clear to all present that the God Patrick proclaimed was stronger than any force. The Druids, according to these accounts, tried again and again to demonstrate the superiority of their gods. One of them, the already mentioned Lucet Mael, challenged Patrick to a contest of powers. He called darkness down over the plain of Tara, and the darkness came, thick and cold as a winter night in the middle of the day. Patrick prayed, and the darkness dissolved as though someone had pulled back a curtain to let the sunlight in. The Druid called for snow, and snow fell over the fields until they lay under a white mantle out of season. Patrick prayed again, and the snow melted in an instant, leaving the grass green and wet and glistening in the sun as though not a single flake had ever fallen. Each time the Druids displayed their power, Patrick displayed a greater power. Each time the darkness advanced, the light pushed it back. Each time the ancient forces manifested with all their intensity, the presence of Christ disarmed them with the quiet authority of one who knows there is no contest possible between the Creator and the creature. In one of the most dramatic moments of the account, it is told that Patrick proposed a final test. A Christian monk and a Druid would be shut together in a wooden building, each wearing the other's garment, the monk in the Druid's robe and the Druid in the monk's habit. Then the building would be set alight, and it would be seen which man his God would protect. The fire consumed the half of the building where the Druid stood, but did not touch the Christian monk. The pagan half burned, the Christian half remained intact. The message was impossible to ignore for those who witnessed it. The God of Patrick was a God who protected his own, even in the middle of the fire. These accounts, embellished by centuries of oral storytelling before they were set down in writing, beautified by popular devotion and by the hagiographer's natural inclination to magnify the deeds of their saints, should not be read as 5th century journalism. They are testimonies of faith, expressions of the deep conviction of an entire people that the arrival of Patrick in Ireland was a supernatural event, a moment when the hand of God intervened directly in the history of a nation to transform it from its deepest roots. But beyond the legendary accounts, beyond the signs and wonders, beyond the contests with the Druids and the confrontations with the king, what we know with historical certainty is that Patrick devoted the rest of his life to the evangelization of Ireland, and that he did so with an effectiveness that has no parallel in the missionary history of the ancient church. He transformed the island profoundly and permanently, and he did it in the course of only a few decades, an achievement that seems almost incomprehensible when one considers the magnitude of the task. An entire island, inhabited by dozens of rival clans, governed by a religious system 1,000 years old and deeply embedded in every aspect of daily life, with no Roman roads to ease travel, no urban infrastructure to serve as a base of operations, no army behind him, no political power imposing conversion by force. And that is precisely what is most extraordinary about Patrick's mission. It was not a violent transformation. There was no military conquest, no imposition by the sword. There was no mass destruction of pagan temples, no persecution of those who resisted conversion. There was no inquisition, no tribunal, no punishment for those who preferred to go on worshipping the ancient gods. Ireland came to Christianity in a way that is almost unique in the history of Christian expansion. It came by conviction, by persuasion, by the witness of one man and his followers, by the intrinsic power of a message that resonated in the hearts of those who heard it as a truth they had been waiting for without knowing it. How did he do it? How did a former slave, without an army, without wealth, with imperfect Latin and a theological formation he himself acknowledged as insufficient, manage to transform an entire island? The answer, I believe, has several layers, and each of them teaches us something valuable about the nature of faith and the way God works in the world. The first layer is knowledge. Patrick knew Irish culture from the inside. He had lived it for 6 years as a slave, had worked in its mountains, eaten its food, slept under its sky, heard its stories by firelight from which he was not invited, but near which he drew close to steal a little warmth. He spoke the language of the people, not as an academic who learns a tongue in a classroom, but as someone who learned it in the fields, in the silence of the mountain, where the only voices he heard were those of his masters and other slaves. He understood their customs, their fears, their hopes, their beliefs. He knew the social structure of the clans, how loyalty between chiefs and their people worked, the role of the Druids, the importance of hospitality, of honor, of a word once given. That knowledge allowed him to do something few missionaries of antiquity managed, to present the gospel not as a foreign imposition, not as the religion of Roman conquerors, not as an alien culture coming to destroy everything the Irish were and everything they valued, but as the answer to questions their own hearts were already asking, as the fulfillment of the spiritual intuitions their own tradition already contained, as the light that illuminated what their myths and legends had glimpsed in. The second layer is strategy. Patrick did not evangelize at random. He understood that Irish society was organized hierarchically, that the conversion of a clan chief could mean the conversion of all his people, that winning the confidence of the powerful opened doors to the multitudes. So he went to the kings, to the chiefs, to the noble families. He visited them in their forts, shared their tables, explained the gospel with the patience of one who knows the seed needs time to germinate. He baptized daughters of kings who later became nuns and founders of religious communities. He ordained priests from the sons of clan chiefs, creating a local clergy that was not foreign but Irish, that spoke the language of the people, that understood their customs, that could hand on the Christian faith in a cultural idiom its own people could understand and embrace. And the third layer, perhaps the most important of all, is personal witness. Patrick did not preach a theoretical faith. He preached a faith he had lived in his own flesh. When he spoke of the protection of God, he was not citing a theology textbook, but his own experience on the mountain, his own miraculous escape, his own passage through the ambush, wrapped in the sacred mist. When he spoke of the love of God for the lost, he was not reciting an abstract doctrine, but the story of his own life, the story of a boy torn from everything he loved who discovered, in the most absolute loss, a God who never abandoned him. His authority came not from an ecclesiastical title or an academic degree, but from the scars of his soul, from the years of slavery he had endured, from the nights of prayer he had accumulated, from the faith that had been tested in fire and emerged stronger, purer, more luminous. The Irish, a people who valued courage and authenticity above almost any other virtue, recognized in Patrick a true man, a man who had suffered as they suffered, who had known solitude as they knew it, who spoke from experience and not from theory. And that, more than any miracle or sign, was what opened their hearts to the gospel. One of the most beloved stories of his method, a story that has become a symbol of his entire mission and of the Irish nation itself, is the story of the shamrock. The tradition tells us that one day, while Patrick was preaching before a gathering of chiefs and Irish warriors, attempting to explain to them the central mystery of the Christian faith, the mystery of the Holy Trinity, he encountered a wall of incomprehension. The Trinity was, and remains, one of the most difficult dogmas in all of Christian theology. How can God be one and at the same time be three? How can three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, each be fully God without there being three gods but only one? The most brilliant theologians of the Church had wrestled with this question for centuries, had written endless treatises, had debated in councils, had created specific technical vocabulary to try to express the inexpressible. But Patrick was not a theologian of councils. He was a shepherd in the most literal sense of the word, a man who had tended sheep for 6 years and who knew that the deepest truths are often communicated through the simplest images. And so, while the Irish warriors looked at him with expressions of confusion and perhaps impatience, Patrick paused. He looked down, and there among the grass that covered the Irish earth, that green thick carpet that was the most distinctive feature of the island's landscape, he saw what he needed. He bent down and plucked a shamrock from the ground, a humble, insignificant plant, one of thousands growing unnoticed in every field, every meadow, every corner of Ireland. He held it up before his audience, those hard men, weathered by war and weather, and said with a simplicity that disarms, "Look, 3 leaves, but 1 stem, 3 persons, but 1 God." The simplicity of the image was perfect. It needed no further explanation, no theological footnotes, no philosophical nuances. 3 leaves, 1 stem, 3 persons, 1 God. The Irish warriors, who might not have understood an abstract exposition on homoousios or perichoresis, understood perfectly what that shamrock was saying. Nature itself, that nature they loved and revered, that nature in which they had sensed the presence of the divine since time immemorial, was revealing to them the central mystery of the Christian faith in their own language, the language of leaves and stems, of earth and rain, of seasons and cycles. Patrick's gesture with the shamrock reveals something profound about his understanding of God and of evangelization. Patrick did not destroy Celtic spirituality, he completed it. He did not uproot the reverence the Irish felt for nature. He elevated it, purified it, connected it to the true source of all the beauty they already perceived intuitively. He showed them that the God of the gospel was not a God foreign to the forests and rivers and mountains they loved, but precisely the God who had created those forests, those rivers, those mountains. The God whose signature was written in every leaf of every tree, in every drop of every river, in every stone of every mountain. From that day, the 3-leafed shamrock became the symbol of the Christian faith in Ireland, a symbol the Irish would carry with them across the centuries, through Viking and Norman invasions, through English colonization, through famines and mass emigrations, through wars and oppressions, as a silent and tenacious reminder of the faith Patrick had given them, of the Trinity an ex-slave had explained to them with a plant from the field. And centuries later, when Ireland became a nation, the shamrock became the symbol of the nation itself, uniting the sacred and the patriotic, the spiritual and the cultural, faith and identity, in a single image that fits in the palm of the hand. There is something beautiful in that. Something I want you to hold in your heart tonight. The deepest truth in the universe, the mystery of the nature of God, was communicated through a humble plant that anyone could find at their feet. The greatest revelation arrived in the smallest wrapping. The most important message was spoken in the simplest words. And that tells you something about how God works. He does not need cathedrals to reveal himself. He does not need libraries or elaborate sermons or complicated philosophical systems. He can use a shamrock. He can use a mountain where a slave tends sheep. He can use a night of sleeplessness where someone listens to a story about an Irish saint. He can use this moment, right now, to plant in your heart a seed that will grow when you least expect it. The other famous tradition, perhaps the most widely known of all the legends associated with St. Patrick, is that of the serpents. It is said that St. Patrick drove all the serpents out of Ireland, that he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights on the summit of Croagh Patrick, that conical mountain that rises above Clew Bay in County Mayo, and that from that summit, through the power of his prayer and the authority of his faith, he cast all the serpents into the sea. The serpents resisted, the legend says. Some tried to bite him. Others tried to coil their bodies around him. One great serpent, the oldest and most dangerous, the one that had dominated the island longest, refused to go and had to be tricked. Patrick asked it to enter a box, promising he would release it the following day, but he never opened it, and the serpent was cast into the sea along with all the others. Naturalists observe, rightly, that Ireland has had no snakes since the last ice age, some 10,000 years ago. The island was separated from Britain by rising sea levels before these reptiles could colonize it after the glaciers retreated. There are no snake fossils in Ireland from any recent millennia. There is no zoological evidence that snakes ever existed on the island in historical times. St. Patrick cannot have driven out serpents from a place where there were no serpents. But the legend, like so many sacred legends, speaks not of zoology, but of something far deeper. Not of reptiles, but of spiritual realities more profound and more dangerous than any physical snake. Serpents, in the biblical tradition, and in the Christian imagination have represented evil since the very first book of Scripture, since that garden where a serpent tempted the first human beings and led them into the fall. Serpents are the symbol of what poisons, of what crawls in the dark, of what hides under stones and strikes without warning, of what injects its venom into a life and leaves it wounded, weakened, slowly undone. And in that symbolic sense, in that spiritual sense, which is more true than the literalness of the facts, the legend is profoundly accurate. Patrick did drive the serpents from Ireland. He drove out the darkness of idolatry, that system of belief that kept an entire people imprisoned in fear of capricious and cruel gods who demanded sacrifice and offering, who never gave true peace in return. He drove out the venom of pagan ritual, those ceremonies where blood was shed to appease deities that were never satisfied, that always demanded more, that never offered genuine rest. He drove out the bite of fear, that ancestral dread of the dark forces inhabiting forests and waters and caves, that fear which prevented the Irish from living in freedom, that kept them bound to a system of superstition and terror. And in its place, Patrick planted something entirely different. He planted faith in a God of love, of mercy, of protection, a God who asked not for blood, but for repentance, a God who demanded not fear, but trust, a God who did not threaten, but protected, a God who did not hide in the darkness of sacred groves, but revealed himself in the light of day, in the simplicity of a shamrock, in the warmth of a community at prayer, in the peace of a heart that knew it was loved. The mountain from which Patrick supposedly drove out the serpents, Croagh Patrick, became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in all of Ireland, and it remains so to this day. Each year, on the last Sunday of July, thousands of pilgrims ascend to its summit, many of them barefoot as a penance, as a sign of humility, as an imitation of Patrick himself, who climbed that mountain with bare feet and a heart full of prayer. The ascent is hard. The ground is rocky, steep, treacherous. The weather can change in minutes, shifting from sun to rain and from rain to mist with a swiftness only Ireland knows. But the pilgrims climb. They climb each year, century after century, generation after generation, because there is something on that mountain that calls to them, something beyond tradition or custom, something that touches the deeply human need to rise, to lift oneself up, to leave the serpents of the valley behind and seek God at the summit. Perhaps you too have serpents that need to be driven out tonight. Not serpents of scales and venom, but serpents of another kind. Serpents that go by the names of anxiety, of guilt, of resentment, of fear of the future, of pain from the past. Serpents that crawl through your mind when the lights go out and the night closes in, that coil around your thoughts and inject their poison, that whisper in your ear that you are not enough, that everything will go wrong, that there is no hope, that you are alone, that no one loves you, that God has forgotten you. If so, I want you to hear this. The same prayer that drove the serpents from Ireland can drive the serpents from your mind tonight. The same faith that cleansed an entire island can cleanse your heart of everything that poisons it. You do not have to climb a mountain barefoot. You do not have to perform feats of impossible spiritual. You only have to open your heart to the words of the breastplate and let Christ enter every corner where the serpents hide. And when Christ enters, the serpents flee. It has always been so. It will always be so. Patrick did not only preach, he built, he founded, he organized. With an energy that is astonishing in a man who had spent 6 years of his youth in slavery and likely carried physical traces of that brutal experience, Patrick crossed Ireland from north to south and east to west, baptizing, preaching, establishing the structures of a church that would endure for centuries. He formed a local clergy, something many missionaries of antiquity did not know how or did not wish to do, preferring to keep control of the new churches in the hands of foreign clerics. Patrick, instead, understood that for the faith to take genuine root in Ireland, it had to be proclaimed by Irish voices, sung in the Irish tongue, lived in Irish communities led by Irish pastors. He ordained priests and deacons from the sons of clan chiefs. He consecrated Irish bishops who would carry on his work when he was gone. He established Christian communities throughout the island. some as small as a family gathered around a wooden cross, others as large as the monasteries that would become the most important centers of learning and culture in all of Western Europe. Because that is precisely what the Irish monasteries became. Beacons of civilization in a world sinking into chaos. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, when the invasions of Goths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks swept across Western Europe like a tide of destruction, when Roman cities were sacked and their libraries burned, when the schools closed and the roads became impassable and the law of the strongest replaced Roman law, the monasteries of Ireland remained untouched. The island had never been part of the Roman Empire and so was not directly affected by its fall. While the continent burned, Ireland flourished. And in the scriptoria of the monasteries, those writing workshops where the monks worked in silence hour after hour, day after day, year after year, copying manuscripts with a dedication that bordered on the sacred, the intellectual legacy of Western civilization was preserved. The Irish monks copied and preserved the works of Virgil and Horace, Cicero and Ovid, the Church Fathers, and the Greek philosophers. They created manuscripts of extraordinary beauty, illuminated with Celtic designs of a complexity and elegance that still astonish artists and scholars today. Interlacings of lines without beginning or end, spirals turning inward as though to reach the very center of reality, figures of fantastical animals dancing among the letters of the sacred text. The Book of Kells, created probably in the monastery of Iona, founded by Saint Columba, a spiritual heir of Patrick, is considered one of the greatest artistic treasures of humanity. A masterwork of faith made into art, of devotion made into beauty. Some historians, such as Thomas Cahill in his celebrated work on how the Irish saved civilization, have argued that it was these monks, these spiritual sons of Patrick, who literally preserved the Western tradition by keeping in their scriptoria the manuscripts of the Greek and Latin classical authors that would otherwise have been lost forever, swallowed by the fires of invasion, devoured by the forgetting of a Europe plunged into darkness. And when the continent slowly began to recover, when the barbarian kingdoms stabilized and the need for learning and culture resurfaced, it was the Irish monks who left their island and carried back to the continent the manuscripts they had preserved, founding monasteries in Gaul, in Germany, in Italy, in Switzerland, sowing again the seeds of civilization in a land that had lost them. All of that immense river of faith, of culture, of learning, of beauty, began with a former slave who lit a fire on an Irish hill. It began with Patrick. It began with the breastplate. But in the midst of all these monumental achievements, in the midst of this historical transformation that touched all of Western civilization, Patrick never ceased to be the humble man who had known slavery and solitude. He never forgot who he was. He never forgot where he had come from. He never allowed the extraordinary fruits of his mission to make him lose sight of the fundamental truth of his life, that everything he had accomplished was not to his own credit, but to the grace of God. His Confessio, the autobiographical document he wrote toward the end of his life, probably when he was already old and sensed that his days on earth were drawing to a close, is one of the most deeply moving pieces of Christian literature from late antiquity. It is not the work of a brilliant theologian constructing elaborate doctrinal systems. It is not the work of an elegant writer seeking to impress his readers with rhetorical mastery. It is the sincere confession, sometimes awkward in its Latin, sometimes repetitive in its structure, always honest in its feeling, always raw in its authenticity, of a man who does not understand why God chose him, who marvels every day of his life at the grace that transformed a slave into an apostle, who acknowledges his limitations with a humility that disarms. Patrick himself, in the opening lines of his Confessio, apologizes for the poverty of his style, for his imperfect Latin, for his lack of literary formation. "I have not studied as others," he writes, "who drank in equally the law and the Holy Scriptures, and never changed their speech from infancy, but were always refining it. My speech and language is translated into a foreign tongue." It is an apology that moves us, because what Patrick calls awkwardness, what he perceives as deficiency, is in truth the mark of his authenticity. proof that his words were not composed by a professional writer, but by a man who lived what he recounts, who suffered what he describes, who loved the one he praises. "Who am I, Lord, and what is my calling?" writes Patrick in a passage that still, after 15 centuries, has the power to fill the eyes with tears. "That you have worked with me with such divine grace, so that today among the barbarians I can steadily exalt and magnify your name wherever I may be." Hear those words. Hear them as though Patrick was speaking them directly to you. The elderly bishop sitting beside you in the darkness of your room, with his hands worn by so many years of work, with his eyes that had seen so much pain and so much beauty, with his voice that had prayed 100 prayers a day for more than half a century. Hear the wonder in them. That genuine wonder of a man who has spent his entire life marveling that God chose him, that the boy on the mountain became the apostle of an island, that the slave became the shepherd of souls. Patrick died, most likely, in the year 461, though some sources suggest a later date, around 493, and historians have debated the question for centuries without reaching agreement. Tradition holds that he died at Saul, in present-day County Down in the north of Ireland, the very place where he had celebrated his first Eucharist upon returning to the island as a missionary, the very place where a local chief named Dichu had given him a barn to convert into a church, the very place where, decades earlier, a former slave had taken the first steps of a mission that would transform an island, and through it, an entire continent. There is something deeply poetic in it. Patrick died where he had begun. The story closed its circle. The man who had entered Ireland as a slave and returned as a missionary rested at last in the place where the second life of Patrick, the life of the apostle, the life of the saint, had borne its first fruits. He was buried, according to tradition, at Downpatrick, not far from Saul. Later accounts tell that angels kept watch over his body for 12 nights, enveloping the place in a supernatural light visible from a great distance. A final echo of the Easter fire he had lit on the Hill of Slane so many years before. His grave became a place of pilgrimage, and with the passing of centuries, devotion to St. Patrick spread beyond the shores of Ireland, crossed the sea to Scotland, to Wales, to Britannia, to every Celtic corner of the world, and finally, carried by waves of Irish emigration in the 18th and 19th centuries, reached America, Australia, every corner of the earth where the children of Ireland brought with them their faith and the memory of their patron saint. The church venerated him as a saint from a very early age, and his feast was fixed on the 17th of March, the traditional date of his death. On that day, throughout the world, millions of people celebrate the memory of a former slave who changed history, of a shepherd of sheep who became a shepherd of souls, of a man who carried light to a place of darkness and left as his legacy a prayer of protection that has not lost its power in 15 centuries. But the breastplate did not die with him. The breastplate went on living, and that perhaps is the most extraordinary thing in all of this story. More extraordinary even than the miracles at Tara or the transformation of a slave into an apostle. The breastplate went on living because truth never dies, because prayers born from authentic faith have no expiration date, because the words a man speaks from the deepest place of his relationship with God transcend the time in which they were spoken and go on resonating across the centuries, like the echo of a bell struck long ago, whose sound still trembles in the air. The breastplate passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, from monastery to monastery. It was memorized by monks who recited it each morning upon rising, as armor put on before facing the day. It was copied into manuscripts by scribes who treated it with the reverence reserved for sacred words, dipping their goosequill pens in black ink, tracing each letter with the care of one who knows they are preserving something precious, something the generations to come will need. It was sung in liturgies, intoned with ancient melodies that have been lost, but whose spirit survives in the rhythmic cadence of the original Irish text. It was prayed in silence by all those souls who needed to feel the protection of Christ around them. Solitary monks in their cells, travelers on dangerous roads, mothers keeping vigil beside the cradle of a sick child, warriors preparing for battle, the dying who felt the darkness drawing near and needed one last light. The Liber Hymnorum, that ancient manuscript preserving the oldest text of the breastplate, survived the centuries as though by miracle, passing from one monastery to another, saved from the Viking raids that devastated so many Irish monastic libraries, surviving the rains and the wars and the fires and the destruction that accompanied the turbulent history of the island. And in its yellowed and fragile pages, written in an old Irish that today only specialists can read with ease, the words of Patrick are still alive, still pulsing with the same energy they carried when they were spoken for the first time on a dark road between Slane and Tara. And tonight, 15 centuries later, that same breastplate has found its way to you. It has crossed the sea. It has crossed time. It has crossed the barriers of language and culture and history. It has traveled from an Irish hill in the 5th century to your room, to your ears, to your heart. And it is still the same prayer. It still carries the same power. It still invokes the same Christ who protected Patrick on the mountain, who made him invisible on the road, who sustained him through an entire life of service and sacrifice. Because the breastplate is not a memory. It is a presence, not a relic of the past, a reality of the present, not a museum piece to be admired from a distance. It is a shield to be placed on the chest, here, now, tonight, in this moment when the darkness surrounds your bed and sleep perhaps is slow to come, and your thoughts stir like waves on a night sea. Patrick prayed it 15 centuries ago. You are receiving it now, and the God it invokes has not changed, has not aged, has not weakened, has not withdrawn. He is the same. He is still here. He is still protecting you. Christ with you, as he was with Patrick, as he will be with you tomorrow, as he will be with you always. The breastplate for your night. And now, after having walked together through the whole life of St. Patrick, from the villa in Britannia to the mountains of Ireland, from slavery to freedom, from the fire on Slane to the Hill of Tara, after having come to know the man who prayed these words for the very first time, I want us to do something together. I want the breastplate to become, here and now, your personal protection for this night. I want every word of this ancient prayer to settle over you like a blanket of light, to enfold you completely, to seal every corner of your space with the presence of Christ. You do not have to do anything. You do not have to move or concentrate with effort or struggle against the thoughts that cross your mind. Simply listen. Simply receive. Simply allow these words to do their ancient and sacred work, the same work they did that night on the road to Tara, when they turned a group of monks into deer walking through the mist, invisible to danger, untouchable by evil. I arise today, and I arise with you through a mighty strength, the invocation of the most holy Trinity. I invoke the Father who created you, who designed every detail of your body and your soul, who knows you by name, who counts the hairs of your head and the tears of your eyes. I invoke the Son who redeemed you, who carried your pain on a cross, who descended into the deepest darkness so that you would never be alone in yours, who rose on the 3rd day to show you that no tomb is final, that no night is eternal, that every dawn is possible. I invoke the Holy Spirit who sanctifies you, who dwells within you like a soft and steady fire, who intercedes for you with sighs too deep for human words, who comforts you in silence when the world is too loud and too cruel. I arise today, and I arise with you through the strength of all creation. I invoke the light of the sun, which tonight rests on the other side of the world, but will return tomorrow, punctual as always, faithful as God himself. I invoke the depth of the sea, that blue immensity containing mysteries no one has ever explored, as vast and as deep as God's love for you. I invoke the firmness of the rock, that immovable solidity that no wind can bring down, as certain as Christ's promise never to abandon you. I invoke the lightness of the wind, which touches your face without being seen, like the grace of God working in your life in ways invisible to the eye. I invoke the swiftness of lightning, which illuminates the whole night in an instant, the way prayer can, in a single second, change the entire landscape of the soul. I arise today, and I arise with you through the strength of God who leads you. The power of God sustains you tonight, so that you do not fall into despair. The wisdom of God guides you tonight, so that you may understand that this moment of darkness is not the final chapter of your story. The eye of God watches over you tonight, attentive to every movement of your body, every beat of your heart, every breath that enters and leaves your lungs. The ear of God listens to you tonight, tuned to your inner voice, to those sighs you cannot even put into words. The hand of God protects you tonight, extended over you like the hand of a father covering his sleeping child. The shield of God covers you tonight, placed between you and everything that wishes to harm you, whether visible or invisible, whether real or imagined. And now, the heart of the breastplate. The words Patrick prayed on the road to Tara, the words that made him invisible to the danger, the words that do the same for you tonight. Christ with you, here, now, in your room, in your bed, at your side, not in a distant heaven or in a time long past, but here, as close as your own breath, as present as the beating of your heart. Christ before you, covering everything that is coming, everything tomorrow will bring, everything that worries you about the future, everything you cannot control or predict. Christ is already there, in that tomorrow that frightens you, waiting for you with open arms. Christ behind you, guarding your back, protecting your past, closing the doors through which painful memories try to slip into your night, healing what has already been, redeeming what you believed was lost forever. Christ within you, in the deepest part of your being, in that sacred place no one else can enter, where your soul breathes, where your truest self rests in God. Christ dwells in your interior, the way light dwells in a lamp, the way fire dwells in embers, the way life dwells in a seed. Christ beneath you, holding you, bearing the weight of your tired body, your exhausted mind, your wounded heart. You will not fall. You cannot fall, because beneath you are the everlasting arms of the God who does not release what he loves. Christ above you, like a sky of mercy stretching from horizon to horizon, without fracture, without gap, without space for condemnation or judgment or shame to enter. Only grace, only love, only protection. Christ on your right, Christ on your left, closing every flank, covering every side, ensuring that nothing reaches you from any direction. You are completely surrounded. You are completely covered. You are completely safe. Christ when you lie down, which is right now, in this very moment. Christ when you sit, when tomorrow you sit at your table or in your place of work. Christ when you arise, when tomorrow you open your eyes and the sun comes through your window, and a new day begins with the promise of his faithful. Christ in the heart of every person who thinks of you tonight, because someone is thinking of you right now, someone who loves you, someone who prays for you, and in that person's heart, Christ is present too. Christ in the mouth of all who speak of you. May the words others say about you be blessed, filtered through grace, softened by love. Christ in every eye that sees you. May no one look at you with malice. May no one look at you with contempt. May every glance you receive be lit by the compassion of God. Christ in every ear that hears you. May your words be received with kindness. May your voice be valued. May what you have to say find ears willing to understand you. The breastplate is on. The armor is in place. The shield is raised. The sacred mist enfolds you. The soldiers of fear search for you in the darkness, but they cannot find you. They see only a deer walking serenely through the mist, a fawn trotting behind, the peace of God moving in silence along a protected road. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly, and again. Feel the weight of your body sinking gently into the bed. Feel the tension releasing from your shoulders, from your jaw, from your hands. There is nothing to hold on to tonight. There is nothing to guard or manage or solve. Every door is closed. Every window is sealed. Every corner of this room is covered by the name of Christ. The night deepens around you, but in the deepening of the night there is no threat, only the quiet settling of the world into rest, only the soft arrival of the sleep that your body has been asking for, only the mercy of God drawing the curtain on the day and inviting you gently to let go. Let peace enfold you. Sleep draws near. You are not alone in this darkness. St. Patrick watches over you from heaven. That former slave who learned to pray in the rain, who lit a fire in the dark, who walked through an ambush and came out on the other side untouched. He knows this hour. He has sat in this darkness. He has felt this tiredness in his bones and this heaviness behind his eyes. And from wherever he is praying the breastplate over you, just as he prayed it over his monks on the road to Tara, wrapping you in the same mist, placing you under the same shield, handing you to the same Christ who never sleeps, who never tires, who never stops watching. You do not have to figure anything out tonight. You do not have to be strong. You do not have to hold the world together. The breastplate is holding you, and the one who holds the breastplate in place has been holding stars in their courses since before you were born, and he will go on holding them long after every worry you carry tonight has dissolved into the peace of a morning you have not yet seen. If tonight you are carrying a grief that has no name, rest now. If tonight you are carrying a fear that has no clear shape, rest now. If tonight you are carrying a loneliness that the darkness makes heavier, rest now. If tonight you are simply tired, in that deep way that sleep alone cannot always reach, rest now. Christ with you, Christ before you, Christ behind you, Christ within you, Christ beneath you, Christ above you, Christ on your right, Christ on your left. Every direction is closed to darkness. Every direction is open to grace. Sleep draws near. Let peace enfold you. The story continues tomorrow, when you wake rested and renewed, and the world looks a little different in the light of morning, and the grace that covered you through the night is still there, steady and quiet, waiting for you to notice it. Rest now. Rest beneath his shield. We have travelled a long road together tonight. We have journeyed from Roman Britannia in the 4th century to the mountains of Ireland, from the villa of Calpurnius to the Hill of Tara, from the raider's ship to the Easter fire that defied a king. We have come to know a boy named Maywin who was torn from everything he loved and cast into the most absolute solitude, and we have watched as, in that solitude, he found God. We have walked beside him along the dangerous path toward Tara, wrapped in the protective mist of the breastplate, invisible to evil, untouchable by fear. And we have opened together the oldest and most powerful prayer in the Celtic Christian tradition, letting each of its words settle over us like a layer of light. Now, before we say goodnight, I want to leave you with one image. I want you to carry with you, into the sleep that is drawing near, a single image to accompany you through the whole of the night. Picture Patrick, not the famous bishop, not the saint of the holy cards, not the symbol of a nation. Picture the boy, picture the 16-year-old, alone on an Irish mountain, beneath an enormous sky heavy with stars, surrounded by sleeping sheep, with the wind moving softly through the grass. Picture him kneeling on the wet earth, his hands folded, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a prayer that no one else can hear. Picture the peace on his face. Picture the trust in his posture. Picture the faith in his heart. That faith discovered in the darkness. That faith that does not need to see in order to believe. That faith that knows, with a certainty deeper than any reasoning, that he is not alone. That boy is you tonight. That mountain is your room. Those stars are the same ones that shine above your roof. And the God who protected Patrick on his mountain is the same God who is protecting you in your bed, right now, in this very moment. It does not matter what you face today. It does not matter what awaits you tomorrow. It does not matter how many sleepless nights you have accumulated, how many times fear has woken you at 3 in the morning, How many tears you have shed into your pillow when no one was watching. Tonight, the breastplate is over you. Tonight, Christ is with you, before you, behind you, within you, beneath you, above you, on your right, on your left. Tonight, you are the deer in the mist, walking serenely and untouchably through the darkness, protected by a prayer that is over 1,500 years old and has never, in all those centuries, ceased to work. There is a peace the world cannot give, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, that does not need everything to be all right in order to exist, that can inhabit the heart of a slave on a mountain, or the heart of a bishop before a king, the heart of a saint from the 5th century, or the heart of someone who listens to these words in the darkness of their room centuries later. It is the peace of Christ, the peace he promised when he said, "My peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." That peace descends over you now. It descends the way the mist descended over Patrick on the road to Tara. Soft, silent, complete. It settles on your eyelids and closes them with gentleness. It settles on your chest and quiets the hurried beating of your heart. It settles on your mind and stills the voices of fear, of anxiety, of worry. It settles on your whole body and wraps it in a deep rest, a rest that has been earned, that has been deserved, a rest that is protected by the presence of Christ in every direction. There is nothing to fear, nothing to resolve tonight, nothing to carry. Release the weight, release the need to be in control, release the vigil you have been keeping over your own life. Let sleep come the way the tide comes, natural, inevitable, gentle. Let your thoughts grow still, the way the sheep grew still and settled to sleep around Patrick on that mountain. Let your breathing become slow and deep, like the sea surrounding the island of Ireland. That ancient sea which has been rocking shorelines for millions of years, with the same patience with which God rocks your soul tonight. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I arise. Amen. Rest now. The breastplate is on. The shield is raised. The deer walks serenely through the mist. And you, child of God, are completely safe. This has been Saints for Sleep. Close your eyes, surrender your burdens, and rest in his peace. Amen. Return soon for more stories that heal the soul.